Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling macroeconomics,
Yeah.
which can seem a little intimidating at first,
Right.
but it looks like you've got some really comprehensive notes here,
Yeah.
wanting to get a handle on the core principles.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of unpack everything from how supply and demand work on a massive scale
Right.
to the role of the Federal Reserve and even what different types of unemployment mean
Mm-hmm.
for the economy as a whole.
It's like a crash course in how the entire economy functions,
Exactly.
understanding all the moving parts.
And what I find so fascinating is
Yeah.
that once you grasp these concepts,
Right.
you suddenly start seeing them everywhere.
Absolutely.
It's
It's about empowering you to think critically about
It's like you've unlocked a secret code
mm-hmm.
for understanding the news.
the economic forces that shape our world.
And even making better financial decisions.
Absolutely.
So to kick things off, let's start with
Okay.
what's often considered the bedrock of macroeconomics.
Right.
Aggregate demand and aggregate supply.
Aggregate demand and aggregate supply.
Remember those supply and demand curves?
Yeah.
You probably encountered back in microeconomics?
Yeah.
Well, now we're going to zoom out and look at them
Take that.
from a whole economy perspective.
A satellite view instead of just focusing on one neighborhood.
Right.
Yeah.
So aggregate demand, or AD for short,
Yeah.
represents the total spending in an economy. Now, it's not just random spending. There's a handy formula to break it down.
True.
AD equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M.
Think of it like a recipe
Okay.
for total spending, with each ingredient playing a crucial role.
Right.
So C represents consumer spending, like when we buy groceries or clothes or that new gadget we've been eyeing.
Or a fancy cup of coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we've got I,
Yeah.
which stands for investments made by businesses.
Yeah.
This could be anything from buying new equipment to expanding their factories.
Right.
Then we have G.
G represents government spending.
Okay.
Things like building roads,
Yeah.
schools,
Uh-huh.
and other public infrastructure projects.
And finally, there's X minus M,
Right.
which represents net exports.
Yes.
So this is the value of a country's exports
Uh-huh.
minus the value of its imports.
Yes.
So basically, it tells us how much a country is selling
Right.
to the rest of the world
Right.
compared to how much it's buying.
And here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
If any of these components, like consumer spending or government spending, change, it affects the entire AD pie.
So, for instance, if the government decides to invest heavily in, say, renewable energy infrastructure,
Yeah.
that would boost G in our formula.
Exactly.
Right.
And that increase in government spending would shift the entire aggregate demand curve to the right,
Okay.
indicating that at each price level, the total demand for goods and services in the economy has increased.
But wait, wouldn't those infrastructure projects create jobs leading to more income for people?
Right.
And potentially even more spending?
Absolutely.
Is that where the multiplier effect comes in?
You're exactly right.
Okay.
The multiplier effect is a key concept in macroeconomics.
Yeah.
It essentially means that an initial change in spending
Right.
can trigger a chain reaction
Okay.
throughout the economy. Think of it like dropping a pebble in a pond.
Oh.
The ripples spread out,
Okay.
much wider than the initial splash.
Okay, so we can see how government spending can have a ripple effect. What about something like a change in consumer confidence?
Yeah.
Like if people suddenly become worried about the economy,
Consumer confidence plays a huge role in economic activity.
wouldn't that affect C in our AD formula?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If people are feeling optimistic about the future,
Right.
they're more likely to spend money, which boosts AD.
Yeah.
But if they're worried about losing their jobs
Right.
or a recession, they might cut back on spending,
Yeah.
which could lead to a decrease in AD.
So psychology plays a role
You got it.
in macroeconomics too.
Human behavior, expectations, and sentiment are all important factors.
Not just numbers and equations.
Yeah.
This is making a lot more sense now.
Good.
But what about the other side of the equation?
Okay.
Aggregate supply, or AS.
Right.
What is that?
Aggregate supply represents the total quantity of goods and services
Okay.
that producers in an economy are willing and able to supply at different price levels.
So if prices go up,
Yes.
businesses are generally willing to produce more.
Exactly.
Because they can earn higher profits.
And that's why the aggregate supply curve usually slopes upwards.
Right.
Just like the individual supply curves we discussed in microeconomics.
Yeah.
But here's where things get a bit more nuanced.
Okay.
The shape of the AS curve can actually change.
Right.
Depending on where the economy is in the business cycle.
I vaguely remember reading something about that.
Okay.
Isn't that something, like in the short run, the AS curve is usually upward sloping?
That's right.
But in the long run, it becomes more vertical.
In the short run, businesses can increase production somewhat when prices rise. They might hire more workers, add extra shifts, or utilize their existing capacity more intensively. But in the long run, we're talking about the economy's potential output, the maximum sustainable level of production. And that's largely determined by factors like technology, the size and skills of the workforce, and the availability of natural resources.
So even if prices go up, a country can't magically produce more.
Exactly.
If it's already operating at its full potential.
Think of it like a car engine.
Okay.
You can push the gas pedal down, but if you're already at top speed, you're not going to go any faster. You've hit the limit of what your engine can handle.
That's a great analogy. So when AD and AS intersect, we get the equilibrium price level and real GDP.
Precisely.
For the economy.
It's the sweet spot. Where the total quantity of goods and services demanded equals the total quantity supplied.
But of course, the economy is constantly in flux. So what happens?
Oh, what happens?
When things get out of whack?
During a recession.
Like, say what happens during a recession?
People get nervous about the economy.
Well, during a recession.
Businesses might hold back on investments.
People get nervous about the economy.
And overall spending decreases. Exactly.
Businesses might hold back on investments.
And that decrease in spending.
And overall spending decreases.
Translates into a drop in aggregate demand, causing the AD curve to shift to the left.
So the equilibrium point shifts, leading to lower output. And potentially even deflation. Which is a general decrease in prices.
And that's when the government might step in. With expansionary fiscal policy.
Now, hold on. I'm a little fuzzy on what fiscal policy actually means. It's one of those terms I remember from economics class. But could you refresh my memory?
Of course. Fiscal policy refers to the government's use of spending and taxes to influence the economy. So during a recession, they might increase government spending on things like infrastructure projects. Or they might cut taxes to give people more money to spend.
So it's like, if the economy is sputtering,
the idea is to shift that AD curve back to the right.
The government can step on the gas by spending more.
And stimulate economic activity.
Or cutting taxes.
What about when the economy is booming?
Okay.
And things get a little too hot.
Yeah, what happens?
What happens when AD shifts too far to the right?
When the economy is booming and things get a little too hot.
That's when we have to worry about inflation.
That's when we have to worry about inflation, right.
Prices start going up.
Prices start going up.
Because there's too much money.
Yeah, because there's too much money chasing too few goods.
Chasing too few goods.
And this can lead to a sustained increase.
This can lead to a sustained increase.
In the general price level.
In the general price level.
And if it gets out of control.
And if it gets out of control.
It can really erode people's purchasing power.
It can really erode people's purchasing power.
And destabilize the economy.
And destabilize the economy.
So it's like the economy is overheating.
It's like,
and we need to find a way to cool things down.
And that's when the government might use contractionary fiscal policy.
So that would mean increasing taxes. Or cutting government spending.
The goal is to bring AD back down.
Kind of like tapping the brakes on the economy.
To a more sustainable level.
Right.
And keep inflation in check.
It sounds like a really tough job.
It certainly is.
Trying to steer the economy in the right direction.
Macroeconomics involves understanding a whole web.
It's a lot more complex than I realized.
Of interconnected factors. And how they interact with each other. It's like a giant puzzle.
Okay.
And we're trying to fit all the pieces together.
So we've covered AD and AS. The two fundamental forces that drive the economy. But how does a country actually decide what to produce with its limited resources? Isn't there a model for that?
You're talking about the production possibilities frontier. or PPF.
This is where we start talking about opportunity cost, right? Huh? That whole choosing one thing.
You got it.
Means giving up something else idea.
Let's imagine a simplified scenario.
Okay.
Picture a farmer.
Okay.
Who can grow either apples or oranges on their land.
Okay.
The PPF shows all the different combinations of apples and oranges they could produce if they use all their land and resources efficiently.
So if they decide to grow more apples,
they'll
have to give up some oranges.
It's a trade-off.
And vice versa. It's a trade-off.
And the PPF depicts this beautifully.
Right.
It's usually shown as a curve. And any point on that curve represents an efficient use of resources.
So if the farmer is producing at a point on the curve, they're making the most of what they have.
They're operating at their full potential.
Right.
Given their current resources and technology.
But what if they're producing?
At
a point inside the curve?
At a point inside the curve.
That would mean they're underutilizing their resources.
That would mean that they are underutilizing their resources.
Maybe some land is left fallow. Or not all of their workers are employed. And what about a point? Outside the curve. What would that mean?
That represents a combination of apples and oranges.
Okay.
That's currently unattainable with their existing resources and technology.
Okay.
It's like a goal they could strive for.
So if the farmer invests in some fancy new technology, that helps them grow more apples and oranges.
That's economic growth.
The entire PPF could shift outward.
They've expanded the possibilities of what they can produce.
And this applies. Not just to farmers. But to entire countries as well. So when we talk about a nation investing in things like education, infrastructure, or research and development, we're essentially talking about shifting their PPF outward.
It's about investing in the future.
Which leads to a greater potential for production.
Not just for the farmer.
And ultimately a higher standard of living.
Not for a single country.
Wow.
But for the global economy as a whole.
This is really starting to come together for me.
Good.
But what about the folks who control the money supply? The Federal Reserve.
The Fed.
Where do they fit into?
They're like the conductors.
This whole macroeconomic picture.
Of the economic orchestra.
Okay, break it down for me.
Trying to keep everything in harmony.
What exactly is monetary policy?
They have a powerful set of tools at their disposal.
It seems like a lot of power.
To influence the economy.
Yeah.
Primarily through what's called monetary policy.
So they can literally control...
Monetary policy refers to the actions that a central bank...
How much money is circulating in the economy?
In the U.S., that's the Federal Reserve.
That seems like a lot of power.
Takes to manage the money supply and interest rates.
It is a lot of power.
So they can literally control how much money is circulating.
And they wield it very carefully.
In the economy.
Right.
It is a lot of power.
With the aim of...
And they wield it very carefully.
Maintaining stable prices.
And the aim of maintaining stable prices.
And promoting full employment.
They
have three main tools.
They use to accomplish this.
Open
market operations.
Okay.
Reserve requirement. And the discount rate.
Let's start with open market operations.
Okay.
Which always sounds a bit mysterious to me.
It's actually pretty straightforward.
Can you demystify it a little?
When the Fed wants to increase the money supply,
they
buy U.S. Treasury bonds from banks.
Okay.
This injects cash directly into the banking system, which then makes more money available for banks to lend out to businesses and consumers.
So they're essentially pumping money into the system.
When they want to decrease the money supply
through the bond market,
they do the reverse.
And when they want to decrease the money supply,
they sell bonds.
Say to combat inflation.
Which pulls money out of circulation.
They do the reverse,
Now let's talk about those other two tools.
They sell bonds, which pulls money out of circulation.
Reserve requirements and the discount rate.
Okay.
Reserve requirements refer to the percentage of deposits.
Now let's talk about those other two tools.
That banks are required to hold in reserve.
Reserve requirements.
Rather than lending out.
And the discount rate.
So if the Fed lowers the reserve requirement, banks can lend out more money.
So if the Fed lowers the reserve requirement,
which could potentially stimulate the economy,
banks can lend out more money.
And the discount rate is the interest rate.
Which could potentially stimulate the economy.
At which banks can borrow money directly from the Fed.
So by adjusting this discount rate, The Fed can make it more or less expensive for banks to borrow?
The Fed can make it more or less expensive for banks to borrow.
Which in turn influences the interest rates.
Which in turn influences the interest rates.
That banks charge their customers.
The banks charge their customers.
Okay.
It's all about influencing the flow of money and credit.
So the Fed has these powerful tools
throughout the economy
to influence the money supply and interest rates.
Right.
But how do we actually measure
the
relationship between the money supply and things like inflation and output? Is there like a formula for that?
There is.
Whoa, that looks pretty intimidating.
It's called the quantity theory of money.
Can you break it down for me?
And it's represented by the equation MV equals PY.
Not to worry. M stands for the money supply.
Not to worry.
V represents the velocity of money.
Stands for the money supply.
How quickly money changes hands in the economy.
V represents the velocity of money.
P is the average price level.
How quickly money changes hands in the economy.
And Y represents real output.
P is the average price level.
Or real GDP.
And Y represents real output or real GDP.
So if the money supply, M, grows faster than the economy's ability.
So if the money supply
to produce goods and services, Y
grows faster than the economy's ability.
Prices, P, will likely rise.
To produce goods and services, Y.
In other words, we get inflation.
Prices, P, will likely rise.
You got it.
In other words, we get inflation.
The quantity theory of money.
You got it.
Highlights a crucial concept.
The quantity theory of money highlights a crucial concept.
Simply printing more money.
Simply printing more money.
Doesn't magically make a country richer.
Doesn't magically make a country richer.
If production doesn't keep pace.
If production doesn't keep pace.
With the increase in the money supply.
With the increase in the money supply.
You can actually end up with inflation.
You can actually end up with inflation.
Which can have a destabilizing effect.
On
the economy. So you're saying there's a delicate balance.
It's not just about how much money is out there.
Between the money supply?
It's about how effectively that money is being used.
And the real economy.
To support productive activity.
So when the economy is sluggish, the Fed can use what's called
expansionary monetary policy.
The Fed can use what's called
to try to stimulate things.
Expansionary monetary policy.
Is that right?
To try to stimulate things you're catching on quickly. They can buy bonds.
Lower reserve requirements. Or reduce the discount rate. All of which increase the money supply. And lower interest rates. Encouraging businesses to borrow and invest.
And consumers to spend more freely. But if things are getting out of control, and inflation is becoming a problem, the Fed can hit the brakes. With contractionary monetary policy. Right.
Exactly.
That means selling bonds. Raising reserve requirements. Or increasing the discount rate. All of which decrease the money supply. And raise interest rates. Hopefully cooling down the economy. And putting a lid on inflation. This is all starting to make a lot more sense.
Okay.
But what about something called elasticity?
Okay.
I remember hearing that term before.
Elasticity is a really important concept.
But I can't quite recall what it means in the context of economics.
It's all about how sensitive one variable is.
Can you remind me?
To changes in another.
What that's all about.
For example, when we talk about price elasticity, we're looking at how responsive the quantity demanded.
Let's make this more concrete.
Or supplied of a good is to changes in its price.
Say the price of gasoline goes up.
Okay.
What happens to the quantity demanded?
That depends on the price elasticity of demand.
Okay.
For gasoline, if demand is elastic, meaning people are very sensitive to price changes, then a price increase will lead to a significant decrease in the quantity demanded.
So people might drive less carpool more?
Or
switch to more fuel-efficient cars.
If
gas prices get too high.
You got it. But if demand is inelastic, meaning people are not very sensitive to price changes, then even a big price increase might not have much impact on how much gasoline they buy.
So they'll grumble about the high prices?
So they'll grumble about the high prices.
Might keep filling up their tanks.
But keep filling up their tanks.
Because they still need to get to work.
Because they still need to get to work.
And go about their daily lives.
And go about their daily lives, exactly.
Exactly.
And understanding price elasticity can help businesses make better pricing decisions.
Right.
Policymakers.
Yeah.
Anticipate the effects of taxes and subsidies. And economists. Model how various shocks to the economy might play out.
Wow. It's amazing how something... Yeah. That sounds so theoretical.
It's not just about the price elasticity of demand.
It can have such real-world applications.
We also have to consider the price elasticity of supply. And it's not just about...
That's right.
The price elasticity of demand.
For example,
we also have to consider...
If the price of a product goes up...
The price elasticity of supply?
But producers have a difficult time.
Increasing supply quickly? We'd say that supply is inelastic.
Okay.
This often happens with agricultural products.
So if the price of a product goes up...
Where it takes time.
But producers have a difficult time increasing supply quickly?
To plant and harvest crops.
We'd say that supply is inelastic.
So even if farmers want to capitalize...
This often happens with agricultural products,
our prices,
where it takes time to plant and harvest crops.
They might not be able to ramp up production immediately.
So even if farmers want to capitalize on higher prices, they might not be able to ramp up production immediately.
And this can have significant implications for how prices fluctuate.
Okay, I'm starting to get a better grasp of...
In response to changes in demand.
How elasticity works.
Right.
But what about other types of elasticity? You mentioned cross-price elasticity earlier. What's that all about? Can you remind me?
Cross-price elasticity.
Yeah.
Measures how the demand for one good
what that is
affected by changes in the price of another good.
Okay.
It helps us understand the relationships.
So, for example,
between different products.
If the price of coffee goes way up
in the market,
people might start drinking more tea instead.
Exactly.
Right.
Coffee and tea are substitutes. Goods that can be used in place of each other.
Okay.
So when the price of one goes up, the demand for the other tends to increase.
And what about
complements?
Complements.
Goods that are typically consumed together. Like peanut butter and jelly.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Complements are goods that go hand in hand.
Okay.
So if the price of peanut butter goes up,
right,
the demand for jelly might actually decrease.
I never thought about it that way.
Even if the price of jelly stays the same.
So cross-price elasticity helps us understand.
People are buying less peanut butter.
How changes in the price of one good, so they need less jelly,
can ripple through the market.
To go with it.
And affect demand for other goods.
Exactly.
Right.
It's all about those interconnected relationships.
This is really fascinating.
In the economy.
And there's one more type.
Of
elasticity you mentioned?
Income elasticity of demand. How does that fit into the picture?
Income elasticity of demand measures how the quantity demanded of a good changes in response to changes in income.
Okay.
This helps us understand how consumer behavior shifts as people's incomes rise or fall.
So if people's incomes go up, they might buy more luxury goods.
Exactly.
Like fancy cars or designer clothes.
Luxury goods have a high income elasticity of demand.
Right.
As people's incomes rise, they have more disposable income to spend on these non-essential items.
Yeah.
On the other hand, necessities, like food and housing, tend to have a lower income elasticity of demand.
Because people need them.
Right.
Regardless of their income level.
So income elasticity helps us understand which goods are more sensitive to changes in income.
Absolutely.
Which is valuable information.
And it can also inform government policies.
For businesses trying to forecast demand.
Aimed at stimulating specific sectors of the economy.
And make strategic decisions.
Or supporting households during times of economic hardship.
Right. This is incredibly insightful. I'm starting to see how elasticity plays a role in everything.
Okay.
From consumer behavior to government policy.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to another topic that's always in the news.
Okay.
Taxes.
Taxes.
We know they're necessary to fund government services.
Right.
But they can also have some interesting economic effects, right?
One of the key things to understand about taxes is that they can create what's called deadweight loss.
Okay.
Which is a reduction in economic efficiency that occurs.
Wait, back up a second. Pareto optimal.
When the equilibrium for a good or service is not Pareto optimal.
What does that even mean?
It means that it's impossible to make one person better off without making someone else worse off. It's like reaching a point where you've squeezed all the possible efficiency out of a situation.
Got it. So how do taxes interfere with that?
When a tax is imposed, it creates a wedge between the price buyers pay and the price sellers receive. This could distort market signals and lead to a reduction in the quantity traded, which means some potential gains from trade are lost.
Can you give me a visual for this? I'm a visual learner.
Imagine a supply and demand graph where the point of intersection represents the equilibrium price and quantity. Let's say a tax is introduced. This will shift either the supply curve or the demand curve, creating a new equilibrium with a higher price for buyers and a lower price for sellers. And the difference between those two prices, that's the tax.
I'm starting to see the picture, but where does that deadweight loss come in?
The deadweight loss is represented by a triangle on the graph. The area between the original supply and demand curves and the new supply or demand curve after the tax is imposed.
So it's like a loss of potential economic activity.
It represents the transactions that would have taken place in a free market.
Transactions that could have benefited both buyers and sellers.
But don't happen because of the tax.
But are now gone because of the tax.
Exactly.
And the size of that deadweight loss depends on the elasticity.
And the size of that deadweight loss depends on the elasticity.
Of demand and supply.
Of demand and supply if both demand and supply are very elastic. Meaning people are highly responsive to price changes. The deadweight loss will be larger.
That makes sense. If people are really sensitive to price changes, even a small tax could lead to a big drop in transactions.
So it seems like policymakers need to carefully consider the potential for deadweight loss when designing tax policies. Absolutely. Okay, so taxes are a lot more nuanced.
It's a classic example of the trade-offs that economists and policymakers
than I initially thought
are constantly grappling with.
It's not just about the government collecting money.
They have to weigh the need for tax revenue to fund important government programs.
It's about understanding
against the potential negative effects on economic efficiency.
The incentives and behavioral responses they create. Yeah, this has been a really eye-opening conversation.
Taxes are a powerful tool that can influence everything.
It's amazing how seemingly simple things like taxes,
from consumption and investment,
can have such ripple effects throughout the economy.
To work effort and innovation.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's a whole world.
There's a whole world
of fascinating economic concepts.
Of fascinating economic concepts and principles.
And principles waiting to be explored.
Waiting to be explored.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture of how markets work.
I remember learning about different market structures back in school, but I'm a little rusty.
Economists generally categorize markets
on the detail
into 4 main structures.
Can you give me a quick refresher?
Perfect competition.
On the different ways markets can be organized.
Monopoly.
Let's start with perfect competition. What makes a market?
Monopolistic competition.
Perfectly competitive.
And oligopoly.
What are the key characteristics?
And each of these has its own unique characteristics and implications.
Of a perfectly competitive market.
For how businesses operate.
Why is it called perfect?
And how consumers are affected.
Perfect competition is a theoretical ideal.
Perfect competition is a theoretical ideal. A benchmark against which we can compare real-world markets. In a perfectly competitive market, you have a large number of small firms, all selling identical products. No single firm has any control over the price. And there are no barriers to entry or exit.
So it's like the ultimate free market where supply and demand truly reign supreme.
It's a completely level playing field.
That sounds great.
Exactly. Prices are driven down to the cost of production.
But is perfect competition really all that common?
And firms earn only normal profits?
In the real world, I can't think of too many examples.
Just enough to stay in business.
Off the top of my head.
Consumers benefit from low prices and a wide variety of choices.
It's more of a theoretical concept than a reality.
You're right.
Okay.
While some markets like those for agricultural commodities.
So perfect competition is more like a unicorn.
Or certain types of raw materials.
A mythical creature that exists in theory but is rarely, if ever, spotted in the wild.
Might come close to perfect competition.
Right.
Most markets exhibit at least some degree of imperfection.
That's a great analogy.
But even though it's rare,
Okay, but even though it's rare,
understanding perfect competition is still valuable.
Understanding perfect competition is still valuable.
Because it helps us understand how markets work in their most idealized form.
Because it helps us understand how markets work in their most idealized form.
Yeah.
I see what you mean. Okay, what about the opposite end of the spectrum?
Yeah.
Monopolies. I know they generally have a bad reputation, but why is that what makes them so problematic?
Monopolies arise
from an economic perspective.
when a single firm dominates an entire market.
So they can essentially charge whatever they want.
This gives them significant power to control prices and output.
And people have no choice but to pay up.
Which often comes at the expense of consumers.
Because there are no close substitutes for their product or service.
That's the gist of it.
Right.
And because monopolies face little to no competition,
yeah,
they may have less incentive to innovate or improve their products.
So we end up with higher prices, lower quality, and less choice.
That's a potential consequence. Yes, monopolies can create inefficiencies in the market and stifle innovation. That's why governments often have antitrust laws in place to prevent monopolies from forming. Or to break them up if they become too dominant.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got perfect competition at one extreme, monopolies at the other.
Right.
But what about those in-between cases?
Yeah.
Like, what about markets where there are a lot of firms, but they're selling slightly different products?
That's where monopolistic competition comes in.
Oh.
Think about industries like restaurants.
So they're not selling identical products like in perfect competition.
Clothing stores.
But they're not a single dominant player.
Or even hair salons.
Like a monopoly. It's like a hybrid model, right?
There are lots of competitors.
You got it.
But each one tries to differentiate its products or services.
Each firm has some degree of control over its prices.
In some way.
Because they offer something unique.
Whether it's through branding.
But they're still subject to competition from other firms.
Unique
offering similar products or services.
Or even just their location.
Right.
So they're not selling identical products like in perfect competition.
So consumers benefit from more variety and choice.
But they're not a single dominant player like a monopoly.
But prices might be higher than in a perfectly competitive market.
Like a hybrid model.
Makes sense.
You got it.
Okay, so we've got perfect competition monopolies and monopolistic competition.
Each firm has some degree of control over its prices.
What was that last market structure you mentioned?
Because they offer something unique.
An oligopoly.
But they're still subject to competition.
An oligopoly is a market.
From other firms offering similar products or services.
Dominated by a few large firms.
So consumers benefit from more variety and choice.
Think about industries like airlines.
But prices might be higher than in a perfectly competitive market.
Cell phone providers or car manufacturers.
Exactly.
These firms are large enough.
And this type of market structure is quite common.
To influence prices.
In many industries.
And their decisions are often interdependent.
It's often driven by consumer preferences.
So it's like a strategic game of chess they have to constantly anticipate.
For variety and differentiation.
Each other's moves.
An oligopoly is a market dominated by a few large firms.
Oligopolies can be highly competitive.
Think about industries like airlines.
With firms constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
Cell phone providers.
With pricing strategies, marketing campaigns.
Or car manufacturers.
Or new product offerings, but they can also collude.
These firms are large enough to influence prices.
Either explicitly or tacitly.
And their decisions are often interdependent.
To keep prices high.
What one firm does can have a big impact on the others.
That sounds a bit shady.
So it's like a strategic game of chess.
That's why governments often have antitrust laws.
They have to constantly anticipate each other's moves.
To prevent collusion and promote competition.
Oligopolies can be highly competitive.
In oligopolistic markets.
With firms constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
Right. It makes sense that regulators would want to step in.
With pricing strategies, marketing campaigns.
To ensure that consumers aren't being exploited.
Or new product offerings.
By a handful of powerful companies.
But they can also collude.
The goal is to create a market environment.
Either explicitly or tacitly.
That's fair, competitive, and ultimately benefits consumers.
To keep prices high.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good overview.
It can be.
Of the different market structures.
That's why governments often have antitrust laws.
Perfect competition.
To prevent collusion and promote competition in oligopolistic markets.
Monopolies.
Right.
Monopolistic competition.
The goal is to create a market environment.
And oligopolies.
That's fair competitive.
It's amazing how the structure of a market
and ultimately benefits consumers
can have such a profound impact on everything.
Yeah.
From pricing and output.
It's a fascinating area of study.
To innovation and consumer choice.
And understanding these different market structures.
Speaking of the real world, let's talk about a topic that affects millions of people.
It can help us make sense of the real world around us.
Unemployment.
From the grocery store to the stock market to international trade.
I know, it's a big concern.
Speaking of the real world.
For policymakers.
Let's talk about a topic that affects millions of people.
But it's also important to understand that there are different types of unemployment, right?
I know, it's a big concern.
It's not just a monolithic phenomenon.
For policymakers.
Economists typically break it down into 4 main types.
But it's also important to understand that there are different types of unemployment.
Cyclical.
It's not just a monolithic phenomenon.
Structural, frictional, and seasonal.
Economists typically break it down.
Let's start with cyclical unemployment. I'm guessing this is related.
Into 4 main types.
To the ups and downs of the business cycle.
Cyclical, structural, frictional, and seasonal.
You guessed right. Cyclical unemployment is the type of unemployment that rises during economic downturns like recessions.
Let's start with cyclical unemployment.
And falls when the economy is expanding.
I'm guessing this is related to the ups and downs of the business cycle.
So it's like a natural ebb and flow of the labor market.
You guessed right.
When times are good, businesses are hiring, and unemployment is low.
Cyclical unemployment is the type of unemployment.
But when the economy slows down...
that rises during economic downturns.
The businesses might lay off workers.
Like recessions, and unemployment goes up?
And falls when the economy is expanding? Yeah. It's like a natural ebb and flow.
What about structural unemployment? That one sounds a bit more complex.
Love the labor market. When times are good, businesses are hiring.
Structural unemployment occurs when there's a mismatch.
And unemployment is low, but when the economy slows down...
between the skills workers have...
businesses might lay off workers.
And the skills employers are looking for.
And unemployment goes up exactly. It's a reflection.
It's not just about a lack of jobs.
Of the overall health of the economy.
It's about a lack of the right kinds of jobs for the available workforce.
What about structural unemployment?
So, for instance, if a bunch of factories close down in a town...
that one sounds a bit more complex.
The factory workers might not have the skills. Structural unemployment occurs when there's a mismatch.
To fill the jobs that are available in other industries.
Between the skills workers have...
or if technological advancements automate certain tasks.
And the skills employers are looking for?
Workers who were previously employed in those roles.
It's not just about a lack of jobs.
Might find themselves unemployed?
It's about a lack of the right kinds of jobs.
Because their skills are no longer in demand.
For the available workforce.
It's a really tough situation.
So, for instance, if a bunch of factories close down in a town...
for those workers...
factory workers might not have the skills.
So what can be done to address structural unemployment?
To fill the jobs that are available.
It often requires retraining or education programs.
In other industries, or if technological advancements.
To help workers acquire the skills they need.
Automate certain tasks.
To compete in the changing job market.
Workers who were previously employed in those roles.
Government policies that encourage investment in new industries.
Might find themselves unemployed.
Or provide incentives for businesses to relocate to areas.
Because their skills are no longer in demand.
With high structural unemployment.
It's a really tough situation.
It can also help.
For those workers.
Okay, that makes sense. What about frictional unemployment?
Right?
That one almost sounds like a good thing.
So what can be done to address structural unemployment?
Frictional unemployment is actually a natural and healthy part.
It often requires retraining or education programs.
Of a dynamic economy.
To help workers acquire the skills they need to compete.
It represents the temporary unemployment.
In the changing job market, government policies that encourage.
That exists as people move between jobs.
Investment in new industries.
So it's like the time you spent looking for that perfect job after graduation.
Or provide incentives for businesses to relocate to areas.
It's not that there weren't any jobs available.
With high structural unemployment can also help.
It's that you were being selective and searching for the right fit.
Okay, that makes sense.
Frictional unemployment also includes people...
What about frictional unemployment?
Who are re-entering the workforce after taking time off.
That one almost sounds like a good thing.
For family or other reasons.
Frictional unemployment is actually a natural and healthy part.
It's a sign that people are confident enough.
Of a dynamic economy, it represents the temporary unemployment.
To leave their current jobs.
That exists as people move between jobs.
To seek out new and better opportunities.
Well, it's like the time you spent looking for that perfect job after graduation.
So we've got cyclical unemployment.
It's not that there weren't any jobs available.
Structural unemployment.
It's that you were being selective and searching for the right fit.
And frictional unemployment.
Frictional unemployment also includes people.
What was that last one again?
Who are re-entering the workforce after taking time off.
Seasonal unemployment. This one is pretty straightforward.
For family or other reasons.
It's the type of unemployment.
It's a sign that people are confident enough to leave their current jobs.
That occurs due to seasonal changes in demand.
To seek out new and better opportunities.
For certain types of labor.
Exactly.
Think about lifeguards, ski instructors, or agricultural workers.
Okay, so we've got cyclical unemployment.
Their jobs depend on the time of year.
Structural unemployment and frictional unemployment.
So seasonal unemployment is a natural part of certain industries.
What was that last one again?
And it's usually temporary.
Seasonal unemployment. This one is pretty straightforward.
Workers might be employed during peak seasons.
It's the type of unemployment that occurs.
And then unemployed during the off-season.
Due to seasonal changes in demand for certain types of labor.
Exactly. It's a predictable pattern.
Think about lifeguards, ski instructors, or agricultural workers.
And workers in these industries often factor it into
their jobs depend on the time of year.
Their financial planning.
So seasonal unemployment is a natural part.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today.
Of certain industries, and it's usually temporary workers.
I'm really starting to get a grasp on how all these macroeconomic pieces
might be employed during peak seasons.
Fit together.
And then unemployed during the off-season.
It's incredible how interconnected everything is, isn't it?
Exactly. It's a predictable pattern, and workers in these industries.
And remember, these concepts apply not just to national economies.
Often factor into their financial planning.
But also to businesses, personal finances, and even everyday decision-making.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground today.
You're right.
It's incredible how interconnected everything is.
It's like I have a whole new way of looking at the world.
And remember, these concepts apply.
That's what's so exciting about economics.
Not just to national economies.
It's everywhere.
But also to businesses, personal finances, and even everyday decision-making.
Okay. One last topic for this segment.
You're right.
Savings and investments.
It's like I have a whole new way of looking at the world.
I know they're both important for economic growth.
That's what's so exciting about economics.
But how exactly are they related?
It's everywhere.
They seem like separate concepts to me.
Okay, one last topic for this segment.
Well, in a closed economy,
savings and investments.
One that doesn't trade with other countries.
I know they're both important for economic growth.
National savings are equal to investment.
But how exactly are they related?
Wait, really?
They seem like separate concepts to me.
That's fascinating, but how does that work?
Well, in a closed economy...
Think about it this way.
One that doesn't trade with other countries.
Savings represent the portion of income.
National savings are equal to investment.
That's not spent on consumption.
Wait, really? That's fascinating, but how does that work?
And that leftover income has to go somewhere.
Think about it this way. Savings represent the portion of income.
So it gets invested.
That's not spent on consumption and that leftover income.
Precisely, businesses use those savings.
I have to go somewhere.
To invest in new capital goods.
So it gets invested. Precisely. Businesses use those savings.
Like factories, machinery, and equipment.
To invest in new capital goods like factories, machinery.
Which in turn can lead to greater productivity and economic growth.
And equipment, which in turn can lead to greater productivity.
So it's like a virtuous cycle savings fuel investment.
And economic growth.
Which fuels growth, which leads to even more savings.
So it's like a virtuous cycle savings fuel investment.
Exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting.
Which fuels growth, which leads to even more savings.
The government budget deficit or surplus can have a big impact on national savings.
And here's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, let's define our terms here.
The government budget deficit or surplus.
A budget deficit means the government is spending more?
Can have a big impact on national savings.
Then it's taking in through taxes, right?
Okay, let's define our terms here. A budget deficit means...
And a budget surplus means they're spending less.
The government is spending more than it's taking in through taxes.
Than they're taking in.
And a budget surplus means they're spending less.
That's right now. Think about what happened.
And they're taking in.
When the government runs a big budget deficit.
That's right now. Think about what happens.
It means they're borrowing a lot of money.
When the government runs a big budget deficit.
Which can crowd out private investment.
It means they're borrowing a lot of money.
Crowd out. What do you mean by that?
Which can crowd out private investment.
It means that when the government borrows a lot of money...
Crowd out? What do you mean by that?
It can drive up interest rates.
It means that when the government borrows a lot of money...
Making it more expensive for businesses to borrow and invest.
It can drive up interest rates.
So the government's borrowing can actually hinder
making it more expensive for businesses.
Private sector investment. I never thought about it that way.
To borrow and invest.
It's one of those counterintuitive aspects of economics.
So the government's borrowing can actually hinder.
And that's why many economists argue that large, persistent budget deficits can be harmful.
Private sector investment?
To long-term economic.
I never thought about it that way. It's one of those counterintuitive aspects of economics, and that's why many economists argue that large, persistent budget deficits can be harmful to long-term economic growth.
All right, we're back. Ready to tackle this final stretch of our macroeconomics deep dive.
I'm ready when you are. We've really laid the groundwork here.
Yeah.
Understanding all these...
We've covered a lot of
fundamental building blocks of how economies work.
It's been quite a journey. But now I'm curious, how do all these concepts actually play out in the real world?
That's a great question.
Like, what are some of the big challenges?
And it's a question that economists and policymakers...
that policymakers are grappling with today.
Are constantly wrestling with.
What are they actually trying to?
One of the biggest challenges right now is managing inflation.
That's certainly been in the headlines a lot lately.
Yeah.
It feels like everything is getting more expensive.
It feels like everything is getting more expensive.
So what can policymakers actually do to combat inflation?
So what can policymakers actually do to combat inflation?
What tools do they have?
Well, the typical response from central banks, like the Federal Reserve here in the U.S.,
I've heard that mentioned a lot,
is to raise interest rates.
But how does raising interest rates actually help bring inflation down?
I've heard that mentioned a lot, too.
What's the mechanism there?
But how does raising interest rates actually help bring inflation down?
Yeah.
Well, think of it like this.
Okay.
When interest rates are higher, it becomes more expensive to borrow money.
Right.
This can slow down consumer spending.
Okay.
Because people are less likely to take out loans for things.
Right.
Like cars or houses. Higher interest rates can also discourage businesses from investing in new projects.
Okay.
Because their borrowing costs go up.
So basically raising interest rates is like tapping the brakes on the economy.
Think of it like tapping the brakes on the economy.
Right.
The goal is to cool down demand.
Yeah.
And prevent prices from spiraling out of control.
Okay, so it's like you're...
But here's the tricky part.
Trying to slow down economic activity.
Raising interest rates too much or too quickly.
Just enough.
Can also trigger a recession.
To bring inflation back down, but not so much.
Because if businesses aren't investing...
that you end up causing a recession.
And consumers aren't spending.
Right, because if businesses aren't investing...
that can lead to job losses.
And consumers aren't spending, that can lead to job losses.
And a decline in economic activity.
And a decline in economic activity.
Exactly.
Right.
It's a delicate balancing act for policymakers.
It sounds like a really tough job.
They have to weigh the risks of inflation.
Trying to steer the economy.
Against the risks of a recession.
In the right direction.
And try to find that sweet spot.
Like, are we going to have a recession?
Where they can keep inflation under control.
Are we going to have runaway inflation?
Without causing too much economic pain?
How do we find that balance?
So it's like walking a tightrope.
It's like walking a tightrope.
And it's made even more challenging
Right.
by the fact that the global economy is constantly changing.
Yeah.
With new shocks and uncertainties.
The world is a messy place.
Emerging all the time.
It's unpredictable. There are things that happen.
Policymakers have to be nimble and adaptable.
That we can't anticipate.
Constantly monitoring the data.
Black swan events.
And adjusting their strategies as needed.
Yeah.
It sounds like a really tough job.
Okay, so inflation is one big challenge.
No wonder they don't always get it right.
What other issues?
It's certainly a challenging role.
Are keeping policymakers up at night?
But it's also an incredibly important one.
What else are they worried about?
The decisions they make can have a profound impact on people's lives.
Another major issue is income inequality.
Right.
Okay.
Another major issue is income inequality.
In many countries, we've seen a growing gap between the rich and the poor.
In many countries, we've seen a growing gap.
Over the past few decades.
Between the rich and the poor over the past few decades.
Yeah, I've read a lot about that lately.
Yeah.
It seems like the gains...
It seems like the gains from economic growth... haven't been shared equally across society. That's a key concern.
And it's not just a moral issue. It can also have negative economic consequences.
And it's not just a moral issue.
So I would think that a rising tide lifts all boats, right?
It can also have negative economic consequences.
That's the idea, but in reality...
How so?
If a large portion of the population is struggling...
I would think that a rising tide lifts all boats.
To make ends meet.
That's the idea. But in reality,
it can actually dampen overall economic growth.
Okay, if a large portion of the population
because they have less money to spend,
is struggling to make ends meet,
which can hurt businesses.
It can actually dampen overall economic growth.
And it can also lead to social unrest.
Because they have less money to spend.
And political instability.
Which can hurt businesses.
Which can further undermine economic confidence and investment.
Right. And it can also lead to social unrest.
So what can be done to address income inequality?
And political instability.
Are there any policy solutions?
Which can further undermine economic confidence and investment.
That can help bridge the gap.
So what could be done to address income inequality?
What are policymakers?
Are there any policy solutions that can help bridge the gap?
Thinking about doing?
There's no silver bullet, but some of the ideas being discussed include things.
There's no silver bullet.
Like progressive taxation.
Okay.
Where higher earners pay a larger share of their income in taxes.
Right.
Investing in education and skills training can also help equip workers.
Yeah, that makes sense.
With the tools they need to compete for higher paying jobs.
So equipping people to get better jobs.
And strengthening social safety nets.
And also providing some sort of...
Like unemployment insurance and food assistance programs.
Safety net.
Can provide a cushion for those who are struggling.
Right. So that people don't fall too far.
Those sound like good ideas in principle.
If they lose their job.
But I imagine there's a lot of debate.
Or if they're just having...
About the best approach and how to balance...
Period of hardship.
Competing priorities.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got inflation and income inequality.
These are complex issues with no easy answers.
What other challenges?
But the important thing is to have these conversations.
Looming on the horizon.
And explore different policy options.
What else are we facing as a global economy?
Okay, so we've got inflation and income inequality. What other challenges are looming on the horizon?
What's coming down the pipe?
What else are we facing as a global economy?
Yeah.
Well, one that can't be ignored is climate change.
Okay.
It's no longer just an environmental issue.
Right.
It's an economic issue as well.
I've heard economists talking about the need for a green transition to a more sustainable economy.
I've heard economists talking about the need for a green transition to a more sustainable economy.
Right.
Climate change poses significant risks to the global economy.
Not just a bear.
For extreme weather events that can disrupt supply chains and damage infrastructure.
Saving the planet.
To rising sea levels that threaten coastal communities.
It's also about...
And valuable real estate.
Economic stability.
And then there's the issue of resource scarcity.
And then there's the issue of resource scarcity.
Right, as the global population continues to grow.
As the global population continues to grow,
we're putting more and more strain.
We're putting more and more strain on the planet's resources.
On the planet's resources.
So this green transition you mentioned, what does that entail?
So this green transition I mentioned.
What kinds of changes need to happen?
What does that entail? What kinds of changes need to happen?
What do we need to do?
It's a multifaceted challenge.
Yeah.
That requires a comprehensive approach.
Okay.
Involving everything from investing in renewable energy sources and developing more energy-efficient technologies to promoting sustainable agriculture and forestry practices.
So it's a huge shift.
We also need to think about
in how we
can design cities and transportation systems
that are more environmentally friendly
and do business
and resilient to climate change.
It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is, but it's also an opportunity.
It is.
To create new industries, jobs.
It feels a little overwhelming.
And technologies that can help us build a more prosperous and sustainable future.
I like that way of looking at it.
Right.
It's not just about doom and gloom.
It's not just about doom and gloom.
It's about finding creative solutions and seizing the opportunities.
It's about finding creative solutions and seizing
that this transition presents.
The opportunities that this transition presents.
Yeah, so we've got inflation, income inequality.
Exactly.
And climate change. Those are some pretty daunting challenges.
Those are some pretty daunting challenges.
It can feel a bit overwhelming at times.
It can feel a bit overwhelming at times. You know, like how do we even begin to tackle all of this?
It's true. They are big challenges, but they're also opportunities.
Yeah.
To innovate, collaborate, and build a better future.
Right.
Humanity has faced big challenges before, and we've found ways to overcome them.
We always find a way.
This time is no different.
That's a reassuring thought, but what can we as individuals do to contribute to a more stable...
That's a great question, and it's one that a lot of people are asking.
Equitable.
And it's one that a lot of people are asking.
And sustainable economy.
The good news is that there are lots of things we can do.
It can feel like our actions are just a drop in the bucket.
both in our personal lives and as citizens, to make a positive impact.
Yeah, like what? Give me some ideas.
Like what? Give me some ideas.
I want to feel like I can actually do something.
We can start by being more conscious consumers.
Okay.
Supporting businesses that are committed to sustainability, fair labor practices, and ethical sourcing can make a difference. We can also reduce our own environmental footprint by making choices like using public transportation, biking, walking, or driving fuel-efficient vehicles, investing in energy-efficient appliances, and reducing our energy consumption at home can also help.
Those are all great ideas.
Yeah.
And what about on the civic engagement side?
And what about on the civic engagement side?
What can we do?
We can stay informed about the issues.
Right.
Vote for candidates who support policies that align with our values and advocate for change in our communities.
It's empowering to realize that we can all play a role, no matter how small.
Absolutely. Even small actions.
In shaping a better economic future.
Can make a difference when we all work together.
This has been an incredible deep dive into macroeconomics.
It has.
I feel like I've learned so much, not just about...
This has been an incredible deep dive into macroeconomics.
Mechanics of how economies work.
I feel like I've learned so much.
But also about the challenges.
Not just about the mechanics of how economies work.
And opportunities we face.
But also about the challenges and opportunities.
In the 21st century.
We face in the 21st century.
It's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure sharing this journey with you, remember?
You're right.
This is just the beginning of your exploration.
There's always more to learn.
Into the fascinating world of economics.
And the more we understand...
Take those brains buzzing.
The better equipped we'll be to navigate the complexities.
And don't be afraid to ask questions.
Of the world around us.
Challenge assumptions and seek out diverse perspectives.
Okay, folks. That wraps up our deep dive into macroeconomics.
Yeah.
We hope you've enjoyed the journey.
We hope you've enjoyed the journey.
And that you're leaving with a newfound appreciation.
And that you're leaving.
For this powerful and ever-evolving field.
With a newfound appreciation for this powerful and ever-evolving field.
And remember,
the economy is a living, breathing system.
The economy is a living, breathing system.
That affects all of us, understanding how it works.
That affects all of us.
Can empower you to make more informed decisions.
Understanding how it works can empower you.
Both in your personal life and as a citizen.
To make more informed decisions.
Of this interconnected world.
In your personal life and as a citizen of this interconnected world.
Keep exploring. Stay curious.
Keep exploring. Stay curious.
Thanks for joining us.
And thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.